Hi friends, welcome to another edition of Quick Tip videos brought to you by dataplatformcentral.com. So last few weeks we were concentrating on some of the latest features which was released in the recent update of Azure Data Factory. So after a brief hiatus we have come back to Power BI. So this week we are going to look into a feature in Power BI which is quite useful and which has been enhanced to support SQL related sources in the latest update. Yes, we are talking about the dynamic query parameters feature. This feature was introduced in one of the earlier updates, but it was not supported for SQL related sources. In the latest February 2022 update, they have enhanced this feature to support SQL related sources. So in this video, we are going to show you a step-by-step illustration of how you can make use of dynamic query parameters inside your SQL sources. For this illustration, we are going to take the case of a SQL Server source and we are going to connect to the SQL Server source in direct query mode from your Power BI desktop. And then we are going to define few parameters and we are going to dynamically use these parameters so as to restrict the amount of data which is going to be pushed into your reporting model and thereby using it for various visualizations. So sit back and enjoy this video. Make sure you understand how you can use this useful feature to connect to your SQL source and dynamically improve the interactivity of the user by choosing your defined values. So without wasting much time, let's go straight and start the illustration by opening an instance of Power BI desktop. So we have opened a blank instance of Power BI desktop and I am going to connect to one of my local data sources. Of course, we are going to connect to this data source in direct query mode because dynamic parameters are used in the case of direct query mode while you are getting data close to live from your source. So let's select the source as SQL Server database, click on connect, and for this illustration I am going to use the local database. So I am just going to pass the server name as dot and the database name as ABC Bytes dev, which is my development database, and I am going to choose the option as direct query and you can click on OK and it will provide me with the list of the tables. I am going to import all the production and the sales related tables to my Power BI model. So all the production related tables, sales related tables are going to be included, and let's click on load and all these tables will be loaded into our Power BI model in direct query mode. So now that the model is loaded, now let's go ahead and check the sales order table. So let's go to the edit query. So if you go to the advanced editor, you can see the query behind. So if you see, it's actually loading to the table called orders. So what you can do is like you can change it from table binding to query binding to start off. So for that, let's go to the advanced options and let's add a query. So we would require a query for parameterizing. So we are going to change it from a table binding to a query binding. So nothing much, we are using a simple select query to select the data from the whole of the table, but it will change the binding from the table binding to a query binding. So now if you go and check the advanced editor, you can see that the code has changed. Instead of a table, it is now actually putting a query. So this is the query binding. Now what we need to do is we can now parameterize this query. So let's see how we can do that. Of course, for parameterizing we need to add the parameters first. So let's go and add two parameters, start date and end date. So we are going to use these two parameters so as to filter the data from sales orders based on a date range. So let's see how we can do that. So you can click on done and go back, and there is a tab for managing parameters. You can click on manage parameters and we are going to create two new parameters. So let's click on new, and the first parameter is called start date and the second parameter will be called end date. Data type would be date time and you can use the current value, any suitable value. So let's use 2021. So 1st January 2020 is the default value for start date, and similarly we are going to add one more parameter which is called the end date, and in this case that is also of data type date time, and the end date we can put it to a more recent date. So 2022, and let's make it February, and let's make it 24th, which is today. So we have added the two parameters now. Now the next step for us would be to use these parameters inside the query. So you can go back to sales orders and you can click on advanced editor, and instead of using it the table binding, you can directly use the source as is now and click on done. So it will bring you the full set of data now. So now what we have done is we have added the query here. So and now we are going to change this query and make it parameterized. For that we will be using a variable called filter query, and we are going to append this static part of the query to the parameters. So let's put this as the static part of the query, and we are going to add a where condition to that, and the column here is order date. So order date greater than or equal to, and then we can add the first parameter. So let's add a variable like this filter query, and that is going to contain the full data as it is from your order table, and we are adding a where condition based on order date, and the value for this order date comes from your parameters. So we have datetime to text start date. This is to make sure that when you are appending values to a query which is of text type, we need to make sure that you are converting your datetime values to the corresponding text values. So the values that is coming from the parameters are datetime values, because you have made the data type as datetime when you created the parameter. So you have to convert it into text. That's why you are using datetime to text, and you are specifying the format. This is the ISO format, which is unambiguous. So we are using YYYYMNDD, and we are actually enclosing them within single quotes, because that is how you pass the date values to a SQL query. And then we have added the less than condition also, where you will add end date. So the main thing to note is that here we will add one date to the end date to make sure that it includes the complete end date. So what happens when you are just passing, it's a date time value, so when you are passing just a date value, the time part will default to the 12 AM, which is the start of the day, but we want to include the entire day. So for that purpose, what we do is we will take the next day by adding one day to it using date.addDays, and we use this less than logic. So this is the common open interval close interval logic we will use for date range related filtering. So once you have added this, now what we can do is, like, instead of that static query, we will pass this filter query, and now we can click on done, and it will now populate. So that value it takes depends on the default value that you set for the start date and the end date. So the default value that you have set is 1/1/2020. So if you see the first data, that will be 1/1/2020. You won't see anything before that, because that is what your parameter is passing, and the end date will be 25/2/2022 until 25/2. So that means the whole of 24/2/2020. That's the data that will be loaded into your Power BI sheet. So now that you have added these date filters, what you need to do next is, like, you need to assign two tables using which you can show the values for these two parameters. So what you can do is, from here you can click on close and apply, so that the logic will get applied inside your Power BI sheet. So once that logic gets applied, what you can do is you can go to the modeling tab and you can add two tables. So there is an option to add a new table. So the first table would be called start date values. You can name it start date value. So because this is going to give values for your start date parameter, and you are going to use the calendar function for that, and you can just put some date here. So maybe you can add it like, say, 2020, 1,1. So this is just the range of values that you need to be shown. So if you want it to show the value till today, you can pass the today parameter also, so it will automatically create that table. And one more thing you need to do is, like, you need to make sure that you are changing the, so by default the column name will be date, just change it to start date, so that, because we have also wanted to add a corresponding table for the end date, so it should not be the same name. So you can just rename it to start dt, and similarly now we are going to add one more table for the end date. So again, go to modeling, click on new table, same way you are going to add end date values table, and again here also you can pass, you can maybe pass the same set of dates, or if you want to pass a different set of dates, that's also possible. So again, you can, based on your requirement, you can pass the range of dates here, so that the parameter will show the corresponding values. So the end date value is now also added. You can go back and change the name of the date column, just make it end dt, so that they are unique. So you have added these two parameters. Now you need to bind these tables to the parameters, so that they take the values from these tables. So for that, go to modeling tab. You can see the new tables that you added. You can see that there is start date value, and go to start date column, and in the advanced you will have something called as bind to parameter. So here is bind to parameter. You can bind it to the start date parameter, and there you have, so it will automatically ask you that there is a potential security risk, because they can dynamically set the values, so there is chances of SQL injection. So if you understand that the values are the format in which you are passing the values are saved, then you can go ahead and click OK. And if you want to make it multi-select, you can do it. In this case, it's a date range, so we are not going to make it multi-select, but we'll see an example of multi-select later in this illustration. So let's not enable it for the time being for these date values. Again, you can go back to the end date, again go to the advanced, and make sure again you bind it to the end date parameter. Go to the bind to parameter and bind it to the end date. So now both of these tables are bound to the parameters. Now you can just save it. Let's name it dynamic mQuery exam, and let's save this. So now the parameters are defined, the query is defined, and also the parameters are bound to two tables. Now what you can do is, like, you can go back to your visualization, you can add a matrix and make sure that you are dragging and dropping some metric from your sales order table, which is the table on which you added that dynamic parameter based mQuery. So add it to the values, it will automatically show you the full count of values. It will take a while because it is running against your data source in direct query. So you can see that it's 1696 and it is based on the values that you passed from your parameters. So what you can do is, like, you can add two slicers now which will be using your parameter value. So the first slicer can use your start date value and you can make it into a drop down, and the second slicer can use your end date value. So as you change the slicers, you can see the corresponding value changes as it is from your source. So on the direct query, you will be applying the value that you are passing from your parameters and it will use that for filtering. So let's make it again drop down. So let's move this to the top and let's move the report to the bottom. And so now if you see, automatically change the count to 3 because we are only looking for a single day of data. So if you want, as you change this, you can see the value automatically changing. So you change it to 7, automatically the value will change from 3 to 9 because it's taking the orders from 1 to 7. So dynamically the value changes. Every time you change your value, you can see the query being executed. You can see that refresh button and immediately the value will also get changed. If you want to have a clear idea of this, what you can do is, for this matrix, you can add as row the date, and you can see that, see, now it's taking from 1st January till 9th January. If you keep on changing the date, automatically it will change and it will automatically execute the query against that. So now it's till 21st February and you can see the data till 20th February. So this is here, maybe you don't have any data for 21st, so that's why it took till 20th February from 1st Jan. So as you see, you can use this dynamic parameters and filter the data as it comes from your direct query source. So this can be a very useful method when you want to restrict your data. Your source has lots of data. You don't want every data to be shown inside your visual. You want the user to decide what range of data they want to see at runtime. Then this is a good method that they can use, making use of these dynamic mQuery parameters. So till now we have seen how we can define the parameters, how we can bind the parameters, how we can use the parameters inside your visuals as a slicer. Now what we are going to see is, we are going to see how the multi-valued parameters work in this case. So we are going to add one more parameter. Let's name the parameter as stores, and the parameter will be based on the sales stores table. So let's now go back to the Power Query editor, right click on edit query, and we need to now go to the manage parameters to add that additional parameter. So let's click on new, let's name it like store, and this time the type would be text, and let's pass a default value and let's click on OK. So we have added the third parameter, and now we are going to make this the multi-valued parameter. So again, let's go back to sales orders. So if you click on the advanced editor, now if you can see that there is a variable which we are using for generating the filter query, and where we are passing the two additional parameters that we added already. Now we need to add this new parameter also inside that. But the catch here is that the parameter can be a multi-selected parameter. So some cases it can have multiple values, some cases it can have single value depending on how the user selects. So we need to first make sure that we are checking whether it contains multiple value or a single value, and depending on that we have to make sure that we pass the parameter values correspondingly. So if in case it's a multiple value, then it will be coming as comma separated list. We need to convert it into a format which the SQL query can use to take it as a list of values. So we need to append the enclosing, open, close codes and similar kind of things. So let's see how we can do that. So we can add a new variable, just like we added for filter query. We are adding a new variable for getting the selected store values. So the variable will look like this. So selected stores, and we will have two conditional statements. So first condition is whether we will check if the parameter is a multi-selected parameter or a single select. So if it's multi-selected means the value type will be list. So that's what we check here. Type of is value type of stores. That means the value of the store parameter is of list. That means the user has selected multiple values. In that case, we will select the values which are coming from the list, and we will append these single quotes in between to make it into a list of values. So once we do this, then we can directly pass these values inside the in operator available inside SQL query. If you see the in operator, it will be like within each of the values that are passed to the in operator, we need to enclose them within single quotes. But the value that we are getting from the parameter will be just the comma separated value. So like a comma b comma c, like that we need to change it to single quotes a, single quotes comma, single quotes b, single quotes, like that we need to enclose them. So for that purpose, we have this text.combine expression where we will prepend it with the single quotes, and we will then finally have one more single quotes, and then for each of the values in between we will change the comma to single quotes comma single quotes, which will make sure that we make them into a list of values. So this selected stores at the end of this expression will have either a list of values which can be directly passed to the in operator, or it will just have a single value with single quotes being appended to both the sides. So we can directly pass this value to the in operator in your query, so that the query can filter the result based on these values. And now the next two things that we are going to do is we are going to add one more variable which is called store filter. This is because we are going to make this filter an optional filter. So what happen in cases where this is an optional filter? So the filter that we are going to add is actually a multi-select filter, but we are going to make it optional, and we also add a value called all, which represents the select all value of that particular filter. So for handling those cases, we have these expressions. So in case it contains the value all, which means that the user has selected the select all, means we will not do any kind of filtration because we want everything from the table to be returned. So that's why we check that condition first inside, and whenever it has this all value, we just return a blank value as the filter, because it doesn't require any kind of filters. And when selected stores is blank, that is what we are checking here. The length of the selected stores is greater than 0, which means that there is some value inside. So only cases where it will have a valid value is when the user has either selected a single value, or the user has selected multiple values and they have not selected the all value. So all value represents the entire set of values. So if they have selected all, means we don't require any filtering for that particular store parameter. And for the other two cases, we will require parameter to be passed. So that's why we are checking it here. So if it is greater than 0, means we will add this filter to the query part and store name in, and we will pass this comma separated list, the list of values with enclosed within single quotes. And wherever we have selected the value as all, then here we will return a blank, so that the length of that will be 0, which means it will go to the else condition and it will not pass anything. It will just return a blank. And what we do is like we will finally append this variable value to this filter query. So what will happen is that this filter will get applied effectively only in the cases where the user has either selected a multiple values which is a value different from the all, or they have selected a single value. Whenever they have selected the value which is all, then that means effectively every value has to be included. So we don't do any kind of filtration. So let's now save this, and let's name this parameter as stores. So now let's close and apply this. So the parameter has been added. So now what we need to do is like we need to again go and add a table to bind to this parameter. So what we need to do is like we can go and add a new table. So go to modeling and click on new table, and we are going to name this store values. So we have added the table now. So if you go there, you can see that names of the stores. So if you want, there is one blank value, you can remove that blank value also. So the blank value is now gone, and now we are going to use this to bind to the parameter. So what we can do is like go to the modeling tab, select the store name, go to advanced, and we are going to bind it to the stores. And here what we need to do is like we have to set some additional properties to make it multi-select. So let's make multi-select is as yes, and the select all also is set to yes. And if you remember, we have set the all value as all. So which means if the customer selects all, means we need to bypass the filter. So now the bindings are all done. So what we can do is like, now let's go back and check the sales order query once. So here we need to do some small changes here because the store name is not a column inside orders. So we need to add the store related join also to this. So let's add that logic here. So we have now changed the query to add the join to the store tables because the store name comes from the store table, not from the order table. So we have added that, and we need to only ensure that we are selecting from the order itself because this is the order data. We are using stores just for this filtering purpose. So let's click on done, and once you close and apply, let's come back to the visual and let's add the third one, which is the slicer based on stores. So now that you have added the additional multi-select parameter for stores, let's add a slicer which will show the store values. So let's add a slicer and drag and drop a store name into it. And to make it more clear for us, let's add the store name in the columns of our report as well, so that it's evident like whether it is doing the filtering properly or not. So let's move it again to the parameters area, and we are going to enable the select all as well because we have already implemented select all for our parameters. So we have implemented select all, and now if you see, automatically the moment you selected Rowlett bikes, you can see only Rowlett bike. If you want, you can have multiple select. So as you select, it will keep on adding to the data, so which means that your filter is working fine. So like this, you can make use of dynamic M parameters by adding these slicers, and as you select the values within these slicers, the query will automatically filter the data based on your slicer selection by directly executing the direct query against your source. So these are all direct query related tables. Nothing is coming from the cache. It's all directly executed against your source and getting the data. So which is very handy when you are working with large systems and when you want to only show a handful of data to your visualization. Now if you want to go ahead, you can also add one more visual. Say let's add a line chart as well, side by side, and let's add, for a difference, let's add something from sales order. So let's add the quantity here as the values, which is coming from sales order items, and let's add a date here. So from the order date, let's add the axis. And to make this work properly, you need to make sure that you are going to the model and making the relationship between order and order items. The cross filter direction should be both, so that the other dimensions can filter the source order item related measures. So once you do this and come back, it should now work fine. So as depending on your changes, it will keep on changing. So only the balloon bikes, bikes and tracks, mats and sons, it will keep on changing, and depending on your date also, it will keep on changing. So the data keeps on changing, as you see, because you selected March 2020, it went till March. Like that, you can keep on changing your selection here, and the corresponding data will be shown in the graph as well as in the tabular report. Every time you see, it takes a while to refresh because it is a direct query, so it has to execute the query based on this dynamic parameters the user selects, send it to your database and retrieve the data. So this illustration shows how you can create these dynamic mQuery parameters inside your Power Query, how you can bind these parameters to tables that you create inside your Power BI model, and then you can use those tables as slicers within your report, so that as you select the slicers, the corresponding parameter values will get passed to your mQuery, and through the mQuery it will directly pass it to the source and filter the data that is coming from the source. And it is already supported for many other data sources, like for example Custom Query, Data Explorer related sources, and currently this feature has been extended to SQL related sources as well, so that you can use it for your sources like Azure SQL database, SQL Server, or even to other SQL databases like MySQL or any other flavors. So this is a very useful feature which can be utilized when you are working with large data, where you want to directly filter the data as it comes from your database, rather than loading the data in your cache and doing some kind of manipulation on it. Hope this quick illustration helped you to understand how we can make use of this extension of the dynamic N parameters with source systems which are based on SQL queries. As usual, keep sending your feedback and let me know your comments. Feel free to follow my channel for getting useful tips on Power Platform and Azure related topics, and press on the bell icon for getting notifications. Meet you all soon with another useful quick tip next week. Till then, bye and thanks for your time.